In a small town in France called Varesfras, in the year 1647, a girl named Margaret Mary Alacoque was born. From an early age, Margaret felt a deep attraction to prayer and the life of faith. Her childhood, however, was marked by suffering. At the age of 8, she lost her father, and her family fell into hard times. Despite these challenges, Margaret found comfort in her love for God. When she was only 9 years old, she made a secret vow to the Virgin Mary, promising to consecrate herself to religious life. However, her path would not be easy. After falling seriously ill, she spent 4 years bedridden, suffering intense pain. But in the midst of her illness, she had her first mystical experience, a vision of the Virgin Mary that restored her health. As Margaret grew older, her mother wanted her to marry, but her heart already belonged to God. Finally, against her family's will, she entered the Visitation Convent in Paris-le-Monial. There, she began a life of prayer and penance, seeking to grow closer to Christ. It was in this convent where her life would take an unexpected turn. One night, while Margaret Mary was praying silently in the convent chapel, a heavenly light illuminated the room. Before her appeared Jesus, surrounded by a divine radiance. His heart, burning like the sun, was surrounded by thorns and crowned with a cross. Margaret fell to her knees, her soul trembling before that vision. Then Jesus spoke to her with tenderness. "Look at my heart, filled with love for humanity, but wounded by the indifference and sin of men. I have chosen you to make my sacred heart known to the world." From that day, Margaret began to have frequent visions of Christ, who showed her his infinite love and the desire for humanity to approach him with devotion and atonement. In one of these revelations, Jesus asked her to establish the Feast of the Sacred Heart, a special day to honor his love and mercy. But not everyone believed in her visions. When Margaret Mary shared her experiences with the other nuns, many looked at her with distrust. Some thought they were illusions of her mind, while others accused her of exaggerating. Even her superiors in the convent doubted her revelations. But Margaret did not give up. Despite the mockery and scorn, she continued praying and obeying the instructions Christ gave her. Her faith and humility began to attract the attention of a Jesuit priest named Saint Claude de la Colombière. Saint Claude, upon hearing Margaret's testimony, felt in his heart that everything she said was true. He became her spiritual guide and defender, helping her spread the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Over time, the nuns and superiors began to notice that Margaret radiated a divine peace and love that couldn't be explained. Slowly, her visions began to be accepted. However, Margaret's mission was far from over. Despite the growing acceptance of her message within the convent, Margaret Mary's true task was still ahead: to spread the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus beyond the walls of the monastery. In one of her visions, Christ showed her his heart surrounded by flames and said, "I want my heart to be known, loved, and honored all over the world. Ask that the Feast of the Sacred Heart be established and that souls consecrate themselves to it." Inspired by these words, Margaret wrote letters and messages, urging priests and the faithful to honor Jesus' infinite love. However, many outside the convent still didn't believe in her. Some priests considered her a fanatic and refused to accept her revelations. But God had a plan. With the help of Saint Claude de la Colombière, the devotion to the Sacred Heart began to spread. Slowly, more religious communities and faithful began practicing the worship of Christ's heart. Margaret, however, knew she still had to offer more sacrifices for the conversion of souls. Margaret Mary lived many years in suffering and sacrifice, always with the hope that her efforts to spread the devotion to the Sacred Heart would not be in vain. Jesus, in her visions, had asked her to offer her life as reparation for the sins of the world. She often spent hours in deep prayer, enduring physical and spiritual pain, while offering her suffering for the salvation of souls. Despite her delicate health, Margaret never complained. Every time she felt weak or exhausted, she looked at the heart of Jesus and found strength in his love. The revelations and requests of Jesus continued, urging Margaret to insist on the importance of frequent communion and the act of consecration to the Sacred Heart. Moreover, he asked her to teach people to honor his heart through the recitation of the novena to the Sacred Heart and constant adoration. During these years, Margaret continued her task, becoming increasingly recognized as a holy woman of God. However, the greatest trial of her life was yet to come. As the years passed, Margaret Mary began to feel the approach of her departure from this world. Her health was deteriorating, but she accepted her suffering with a heart full of faith. Despite her growing weakness, she never stopped talking about the love of the Sacred Heart of Jesus or her revelations. In one of her last visions, Jesus appeared to her again and said, "You have fulfilled your mission, Margaret. Now come rest in my heart. But remember, your devotion to the Sacred Heart will continue to flourish through those who love and honor me." With these words, Margaret felt a deep comfort, knowing that her suffering and sacrifice had not been in vain. On October 17, 1690, at the age of 43, Margaret Mary Alacoque passed away. Her life was a testimony to the transformative power of Christ's love. Although her life on earth had come to an end, her mission to spread the devotion to the Sacred Heart was just beginning to grow. Her legacy would endure long after her death. After Margaret Mary's death, the devotion to the Sacred Heart began to spread more visibly. The Church recognized her holiness, and her message of love and atonement to the heart of Jesus found an echo in many faithful around the world. In 1765, 75 years after her death, Pope Clement XIII officially approved the Feast of the Sacred Heart, just as Margaret had received in her visions. The devotion grew rapidly, especially within the Jesuit circles, who had been her great supporters. Religious communities, parishes, and many families began to consecrate themselves to the Sacred Heart, venerating its love and seeking its protection. Throughout the centuries, the heart of Jesus became a central symbol in Christian life, representing God's unconditional and merciful love for humanity. The promises of Jesus, which Margaret Mary had shared, became known. Those who honored his Sacred Heart would be favored with his grace and protection. The legacy of Margaret Mary Alacoque remains alive today. Her life of sacrifice and her fidelity to the revelations she received made her a beacon of light for all those who seek to draw closer to the infinite love of Christ. Margaret Mary Alacoque was canonized as a saint by Pope Benedict XV in 1920, and her feast is celebrated on October 16th, a day to remember the ardent devotion she lived and preached during her life. Through her example, millions of people have been touched by the love of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Her message is clear. The love of Christ is immense, and his heart is open to all who wish to approach him with humility and faith. In her visions, Jesus promised an abundance of grace and mercy for those who consecrate themselves to his Sacred Heart, and that promise remains true to this day. Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque left us a legacy of trust in divine love, sincere devotion, and atonement for the sins of the world. Through her life and sacrifices, we learn that the love of Christ is a safe refuge, a place where the soul can find peace, comfort, and eternal hope. Her life is a testament to the power of faith and how, even in the midst of adversity, God's love can transform the human heart and lead it to share that love with the entire world. Thus, the Sacred Heart continues to beat strongly in every devotee who, like Margaret, approaches him with trust and devotion.